Romans chapter 11, a commentary by Dr. John Gill. Introduction to Romans 11. The Apostle, having spoken of the calling of the Gentiles and given a hint of the perverseness of the Jews in slighting the gospel, proceeds in this chapter to treat of their rejection, in which he shows that it was not universal, though of a greater part in his time, and which he confirmed by some passage out of the Old Testament, and then points to the end and design of God in casting them off, and exhorts the Gentiles not to insult them, but to learn to be humble and cautious by what was done to them, and foretells the conversion of the Jews in the latter day, which will be general, so that their rejection is not final, and resolves the whole dispensation of God, both with respect to Jews and Gentiles, into the unsearchable wisdom and sovereign will of God. It begins with an objection he saw would be made upon what he had said concerning the calling of the Gentiles and the unbelief of the Jews, that then God had wholly cast off his people. Romans 11:1, to which he answers with a God forbid, a way of detestation, and by instancing in himself who was of the people of the Jews, being yet called, and by distinguishing between some and others among them. There were some who were foreknown, loved, and chosen of God from everlasting, and those were not cast off, but others who were not foreknown, Romans 11:2. And then he illustrates the present case of the Jews by observing how it was with them in the times of Elias, who, though he complained of their apostasy and cruelty, and imagined that there was none left but himself with the worship of the true God, yet there were then 7,000 which were preserved from the idolatry of Baal. Romans 11:2. And so the apostle observed it was now Romans 11:5, there was a small number whom God of his free grace had chosen and reserved for himself, and so were not all cast away, as the objection suggested. And having called this choice an election of grace, he argues the contrary and inconsistency of grace and works in this affair, Romans 11:6. And since it appeared that there were two sorts of people among them, one that were chosen and the other not, hence it was that though Israel did not obtain the righteousness they sought for, yet they that were chosen obtained it, and so were not cast away, when the rest were, Romans 11:7, and that so it should be, or that this should be the case of the greater part of the Jews, that they should be given up to the blindness and hardness of heart. The apostle proves by some testimonies of Isaiah and David, which he produces, Romans 11:8. Hence follows an objection that if this be the case, then God had appointed them to stumble, that they might fall, even all of them, and always continue fallen. To which the apostle answers with a God forbid, as usual, when anything is objected which is abhorred, and observing the view, event and order of things, showing that the fall of the Jews issued in the salvation of the Gentiles, and the salvation of the Gentiles was to provoke the Jews to seek the same mercy, Romans 11:11, and then follows an improvement and illustration of this end, or event of their fall, Romans 11:12. And if the fall and lessening of the Jews were the means of enriching the Gentiles with the riches of Christ and his grace, what a glory must be brought to them when they should all of them be converted and join them, and that the rejection of the Jews was neither total nor final. The apostle argues from his office, even as an apostle of the Gentiles, whom he addresses as such, 11:13, and from his view and the end in executing that office, which was to provoke the Jews to emulate the Gentiles, and so save some of them, Romans 11:14, and then he repeats, in other words, Romans 11:15, the argument he had used in Romans 11:12, and proves the future conversion of the Jews from the instance of conversion and sanctification which had been and were then among them, which were as the first fruits to the lump, and the root to the branches, and were pledges and tokens of a great conversion and sanctification of them hereafter. Romans 11:16. And by occasion of the metaphor of the root and the branches before used, he expresses the rejection of the Jews by the breaking off some of the branches, and the reception of the Gentiles by their engrafting into the gospel church state among the converted Jews, enjoying the same privileges with them. Romans 11:17. And since they were originally of a wild olive tree, and merely of grace partook of the root and fatness of the good olive tree of the gospel church state, as consisting first of the Jews, they ought not to be haughty and insolent and boast and brag over the Jews, since they were beholden to them, and not the Jews to them. Romans 11:18. And whereas an objection might be made that the Jews were cast out to make room for the Gentiles, Romans 11:19, and therefore the one must be more deserving than the other, the apostle replies to it, Romans 11:20, by granting that the one were broken off or rejected, that the other might be engrafted, or taken in. But then, as it was owing to unbelief in the Jews that they were cast off, in which the Gentiles were before conversion, as well as they. So it was by faith they stood in their church relation, which was the gift of God, and owing to his grace, so that their engrafting and continuance in the gospel church state were not the effect of merit in them. Wherefore he gives them this good advice, not to be proud and lifted up with their privileges as though they were of their own deserving, but to fear the Lord and his goodness. From hence they sprang, and suggest that they should be so far from making such an use of the rejection of the Jews, that it ought rather to engage them to caution, care and fear, for they were the natural branches in the olive tree, and if these were not spared when behaving disagreeably, they must not expect to fare otherwise, who were originally of the wild olive tree, should they act unworthy of the privileges they enjoyed. Romans 11:21. Wherefore the apostle recommends to their serious consideration the severity of God in the casting off of the Jews, and his goodness in taking them in, the Gentiles, and threatens them with cutting off, should they slight, neglect, or misuse the goodness of God to them in his house and ordinances. Romans 11:22. And on the other hand, an intimation is given that the Jews, though broken off, shall be grafted in again, should their unbelief discontinue and faith in Christ be given them, which was not impossible with God. He is able to both to remove their unbelief and give them faith and reinstate them in a church relation. Romans 11:23. And it is without doubt he can do it. It looks very likely that he will, which may be argued from the engrafting of the Gentiles, who are like the olive tree, wild by nature, were cut out from thence, and contrary to nature, and grafted into the good olive tree, whereof, by an argument from the lesser to the greater, much more may it be thought that the Jews, the natural branches, will in God's own time be grafted in their own former church state. Some of their ancestors were. Romans 11:24. Yea, the apostle argues the certainty of their conversion and reinstatement into the gospel church from the design of providence in suffering blindness in part to happen to them, which was not intended always to continue, only until the elect of God who are gathered in among the Gentiles. And this mystery of providence and grace he thought fit to acquaint the Gentiles with, lest they should be conceited in themselves, as if they only shared the favour of God and were deserving of it, to the contempt of the Jews. Romans 11:25. Moreover, the apostle affirms that all Israel shall be saved. Romans 11:26, which is consequently deduced from what he had said, and which he proves by the passage out of Isaiah 59:20, and by its being a principal part of the covenant which God had made with them which he will not break, but shall be faithful, when he shall make them sensible of their sins and take them away by the application of his pardoning grace. Romans 11:27. And whereas the implacable enemy of the Jews to Christ and his gospel might be objected to such a gracious procedure of God towards them, the apostle removes the objection by granting that they were enemies of the gospel on account of the Gentiles to whom it was preached. But then there is a chosen people among them who were beloved of God, which would be made manifest because of the oath and promise made to their fathers. Romans 11:28. Wherefore, as the purposes, promises and covenant of God are immutable, so the gifts of his grace and the calling of his people included in them are things certain and irrevocable. Romans 11:29. And so the calling of the Jews and the gifts of his grace designed for them, which is another proof of their calling and conversion, and which is further argued and made both more probable and certain by comparing the case of the Jews and Gentiles together. As for the Gentiles, they were formerly infidels and obtained mercy through the unbelief of the Jews. Romans 11:30. Wherefore, arguing from the lesser probable to that which is more so, the Jews, though for the present unbelievers, yet it might be thought that through the mercy the Gentiles had received, they would some time or other be provoked to seek for, and so obtain the same mercy. Romans 11:31. And the rather this may be given into and received not only because they both have been in a state of unbelief, but the end and design of God, in according to them in it, are to have mercy on each of them. Romans 11:32. Which dispensation of God both to one and the other by turns in different ways, so was amazing and unaccountable to the apostle, that he breaks out into admiration at the wisdom and knowledge of God, which was so abundant that they could not be searched out, conceived of, and 11:33, the reasons of which lay in his own breast, and are only known to him, no one having known his mind or been his counsellor. Romans 11:34. Nor is he obliged to give an account of his matters and the reasons of his proceedings to any of his creatures, so he is not indebted to them for anything, nor does he any injustice to any of them, by whatever step he takes in providence and grace. Let that appear, and recompense will be made. Romans 11:35. Everything must be resolved into his sovereign will and pleasure, and so this of choosing some and leaving others, by rejecting the Jews and receiving the Gentiles, and also that of calling the Jews again, as it is reasonable. Everything should, since all things are from him, through him, and to him. Romans 11:36. And so all the glory is due unto him. Here ends the doctrinal part of this epistle. Romans 11, chapter 1. I say then, hath God cast away his people? The Alexandrian copy adds here, whom he foreknew, as in Romans 11:2, upon the citation of the above passage out of Moses and Isaiah, relating to the calling of the Gentiles, and the rejection of the Jews. The apostle saw an objection would arise, which here he takes up from the mouth of an adversary and proposes it, in which is suggested that God has cast away all his people, the Jews, according to this count. And if so, where is his covenant with Abraham? What is become of his promises? And how is his faithfulness to be accounted for? And what hope can any Israelite have of ever obtaining salvation, than which nothing can be thought more injurious to God and absurd in itself? This was an old prejudice of the Jewish nation, and still continues, that God never would, nor has he cast them away, even in his present condition. It is one of the articles of their creed, received by the Karaites, a sect among them. A blessed God hath not cast away the men of the captivity, though they were under chastisement of God, but it is fit they should every day obtain salvation by the hands of Messiah, the son of David. Now, to this objection the apostle makes answer, first in his usual way, God forbid. When anything was objected which was displeasing to him, abhorred by him, which was not agreeable to the perfection of God, to the truth of his word, and could by no means be admitted of, and next by observing his own case, which was a standing instance to the contrary of God, had chosen him unto salvation, for God had chosen him to eternal salvation. Christ had redeemed him by his blood, and he was effectually called by grace, and as to his eternal state, he had no doubt or scruple about it. And besides, the Lord had made him a minister of the gospel, and greatly qualified him for the work, and had raised him to a high office of an apostle, and had made him very useful to the souls of many Jews and Gentiles. And yet he was one of the nation of the Jews, and therefore God had not cast them all away, as the objection insinuates. For I also am an Israelite, according to the flesh, by line descent from Jacob or Israel. See Corinthians 2:11-22, as well as in a spiritual sense, of the seed of Abraham, the grandfather of Israel, the head of the Jewish nation. He was both of his natural and his spiritual seed, who is the father of us all. Of the tribe of Benjamin, a very little tribe, which in the time of the judges was near being destroyed, and upon the return from the captivity of Babylon was very small as it was at this time, and yet God had not cast away this, much less all the tribes of Israel. Romans 11:2. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. The apostle goes on with his answer to the objection by distinguishing and explaining who he meant by the people of God had not cast away, namely, which were foreknown by him. For all mankind are in a sense his people, being made, maintained, and supported in their beings by him, yet they are not all foreknown. For were they would all be predestined, called, conformed to the image of Christ, justified and glorified. But some of them will be cast away, being bad and wicked, and will be sent into everlasting punishment. And though the people of the Jews in general were the people of God, being in a sense chose, known and distinguished by him from the rest of the world, yet they were not all a foreknown people, and in the sense the apostle uses the word. Wherefore a great number of them were cast away, of which afterwards the apostle speaks largely in this chapter. But then there were a people among them that were the people of God in a more special sense. They were chosen by him from everlasting to be his people. They were taken into the covenant of his grace. As such they were given to Christ as his people, and were redeemed and saved by him on that account, and were to be called with an unholy calling, when they were openly declared to be the people of God, whom he foreknew. He not merely knew them before by his general presence and foreknowledge, which extends to all persons and things, as foresaw their faith, holiness, good works, and so chose them for himself. For faith, holiness, and good works are fruits and effects of electing grace. But he so knew them before, even from all eternity, as that he approved of them, liked them, loved them, and took delight and complacency in them. Now these his people he never did, nor ever will cast away. Their numbers may be but few, small, in small periods of time, yet none of them are cast away. God may not immediately rise to their help and assistance in time of distress, or so soon as they desire and expect. He may withdraw his presence, hide himself, and stand at a distance from them. He may afflict them in a fatherly way, when they may think he has cast them off, or cast them away, whereas he never casts any of them away, nor out of his heart's love, nor out of his sight, nor out of the covenant of grace, nor out of the hands of his Son, nor out of his family, or so as that any of them should perish eternally. So far from it, that he takes the utmost delight in them, grants them the greatest nearness to himself, bears the strongest affection for them, and takes the most diligent care of them. Whoever casts them out of their affection and company, he will not. The reasons are because his love to them is unchangeable. His purpose concerning their salvation stands firm and sure, and his word and oath are unalterable. His gifts and callings are without repentance, and they are his jewels, portion and inheritance, and they are as the apple of his eye, and continually held by his right hand. The apostle next replies to this objection by putting them in mind of the case and state of the church of God in the times of Elijah, and what judgment that prophet formed of it, and in which he appears to be mistaken. Wot ye not what the Scripture saith of Elias? Do ye not know? Ye cannot be ignorant who have and read the Scriptures, what it says of Elias or Elias, that is, as the Arabian version renders it, in the history of Elias, in the account it gives of his life and times, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, that is, how he spoke to God in prayer concerning Israel, and instead of praying for them, as a prophet were wont to do, he was obliged to bring a complaint against them for their idolatry, contempt of the worship of God, and the violent persecution of his true followers. The apostle chose to mention this instance because there was some likeness between his case and Elijah, and the state of the people of Israel at that then present time, and as in the times of Elijah. For as the Jews in his time killed and persecuted the prophets of the Lord, so in the present time they had killed the Lord Jesus Christ and persecuted his apostles. And as Elijah, though one of their own prophets, was obliged to make intercession against them, so the apostle, though one of their own countrymen, could not but speak against them, and of their just rejection by God. And this he observes to soften their resentment against him, when so great a prophet had done so before him. And this the Jews themselves own, for they say Elijah brought an accusation against Israel, and it is observed by another that coals are said of Isaiah and Elijah because they delivered an accusation against Israel. One called them a people of unclean lips, and the other said that they have forsaken thy covenant, which is the apostles' sense. Romans 11:3. Lord, they have killed thy prophets. By the order of Jezebel, wife of Ahab, king of Israel, Kings 18:4. This sin of slaying the prophets of the Lord is charged upon the Jews by Christ, Matthew 23:31, and by the apostles, Thessalonians 2:15, and in the text of Kings 1:19 and 14. It is added with the sword, and which expresses the manner of death they were put to, and this clause is there put after the following, according to a rule of transposition among the Jews. See Gill, Matthew 27 verse 10. And dig down thine altars. Either the altars which the patriarchs had formerly built and were still in being, and though not used, yet were kept and had a great veneration, wherefore the pulling of them down was done in contempt of them, and of the worship of God, which had been formerly performed there, or else such altars which the religious amongst the 10 tribes built since the times of Jeroboam, who forbade them to go up to Jerusalem, but ordered them to go to Dan or Bethel, which they, not choosing to do, erected altars in different places for divine service, and which the Jews say were allowed, for from that time the prohibition of altars at other places than at Jerusalem ceased. And I am left alone, meaning either as a prophet, not knowing that Obadiah had hid 100 prophets by 50 in a cave, Kings 18:4, or else as a worshipper of the true God, imagining that he was the only person in Israel that had a true zeal for the Lord of hosts. And they seek my life, lay in wait for it. Jezebel by her emissaries being in quest of him, it is added, Kings 19:14, to take it away, for she had swore by her gods that by the morrow, about that time, his life would be as the life of one of the prophets of Baal that he had slain. And in one copy it is added here, Romans 11:4. But what saith the answer of God unto him? The divine response or oracle, the Bath Kol or voice from heaven, the still small voice of the Lord which Elijah heard, I have reserved to myself for his worship and service, to be partakers of his grace, inheritors of his kingdom, to show forth his praise, and for his name's sake, for his honour and glory. These he reserved in eternal election, in the council and covenant of peace, separated them in time from others by his grace, and preserved them from the general defection and apostasy, even 7,000 men, meaning either that precise and exact number, which was but small in comparison to the very large multitude of persons that were in the 10 tribes, or else a certain number for an uncertain, who have not bowed the knee, a sign of reverence and adoration, to the image of Baal, Jezebel's god, the god of the Zidonians, a name common to many of the deities of the Gentiles, and signifies Lord or Master. We read of Balaam in the plural number, for these were lords many, of this name in the Greek text, and the article is of the feminine gender, wherefore our translators have supplied the word image. This word has in the Septuagint version sometimes a feminine article, as here, Kings 2, 21:3, but in Kings 1, 19:18, from whence the passage is taken, the article is masculine, as it is also in Judges 2:11, and in other places, the deity being either of both sexes or of no distinguished sex, or it may be the reason it has so often a feminine article is because it was a young heifer, or in the form of one. So in the history of Tobit 1:5 it is said that all the tribes which apostatized together sacrificed to Baal the heifer. The apostles' view in mentioning this instance is to show that when the church and cause of God are at its lowest, God has always some true worshippers of him, and that he never casts away his foreknown people. Those numbers are generally more than they are thought to be by the saints themselves. Good men, as Elijah, may be mistaken in this matter, all which he accommodates to the then present state of God's people, Romans 11:5. Even so then, at this present time also, in which the apostle lived, the time of preaching the gospel, the accepted time, the day of salvation, which then was, and also now is, at that time when the gospel was sent unto the Gentiles, and God took out of them a people for his name, then multitudes of them were converted and embraced the faith of Christ. And when the Jews in general had rejected the Messiah, killed the Lord Jesus, persecuted his apostles, and contradicted and blasphemed the gospel, yet still God had made a reserve of some among them for himself. There is a remnant, alluding either to Isaiah 10:21 or to the oracle delivered to Elijah, saying, I have reserved or left, Kings 1, 19:18, that as God had reserved for himself in Elijah's time a number of persons who had not gone into the idolatrous worship of Baal, when the greater part of the Israelites did, so he had taken care to make a like reserve in the apostles' time, when the bulk of the Jewish nation had refused the Messiah and despised his gospel. This is a further proof that God had not cast away all the people of the Jews. That is, Elijah was not the only worshipper of the true God in his time, so the apostle was not the only instance of grace among that people now. There was a number of them. The number of the disciples after the Lord's ascension was 120 upon the first sermon preached by Peter. 3,000 were converted and added to them, and after that they are said to be about 5,000, and still multitudes were added, both of men and women, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith, so that before the dispersion of the church at Jerusalem by a persecution, there might be at least such number called by grace as God had reserved in Elijah's time. though these, when compared with the generality of the nation which remained in unbelief, were but a few, and therefore called a remnant, or a reserve, as the word may be rendered. For these were a set men, whom God had reserved and preserved in his Son, and in the covenant of grace from everlasting, and had kept a watchful eye over them in time, reserved them in his providence, and saved them to be called, and by calling them had reserved them by his grace, and preserved them by his power from the general unbelief, impenitence, blind and ignorance which prevailed over the people of the Jews, which reserve was not owing to their superior goodness, they being in no wise with respect to nature, birth and privileges better than those who were not reserved, nor to the disposition of their minds and wills, their minds and consciences being defiled, and their wills naturally as obstinate and perverse as others, nor to any good works done by them, since the works done before calling are not properly good, and those after the fruits of that grace. But this reserve was made according to the election of grace. God's choice of these persons before the world was, which is the source and spring of all the blessings of grace, both in time, eternity. Hence, these persons were put into the hands of Christ, secured in an everlasting covenant, took special care of by divine providence, were called by grace, justified, sanctified, and at last glorified, and this choice is owing to grace, for not man's choice of God's grace, but God's choice owing to his own grace here is meant. The Pelagians would have it that this election is the choice which man makes of the grace of God, whereas such is the enmity of man's nature and will against God and his grace that he would never make choice of that. If the grace of God did not first make choice of him and lay hold upon him, grace here does not design the objects of the choice, but the cause, spring and motive of it, which is not any habit or quality in man as faith and holiness, for these are fruits and effects of electing grace, and so not causes, motives or conditions of it, but the free love and favour of God in his own heart, and shows the sovereignty and freeness of election, which is no ways depending upon the will and works of men, but upon the sovereign goodwill and pleasure of God. Romans 11:6. And if by grace, then it is no more of works. Upon election being called the election of grace, the Apostle forms an argument showing the contrariety and inconsistency of grace and works in that affair, proving that it must be by the one or the other, and if by the one, then not by the other, and that these two cannot be mixed and blended together in this matter. If election is by grace, as it certainly is, for no other reason can be given why God has chose one and not another, but his own sovereign pleasure, or that free favour and unmerited love with which he loves one and not another, and not because they are better or had done or would do better things than others, then it is no more, or not at all. For it never was of works, was not influenced by them, does not arise from them, for it passed before ever any were done, and these that are done aright spring from it, and therefore could never be the rule and measure and causes, motives and conditions of it. Otherwise grace is no more grace. For grace, as Austin has long ago observed, is not grace unless it is altogether free. It will lose its nature, and ought to change its name, and be no more called or reckoned grace, but a due debt, and a choice of persons to salvation should be thought not to be what God is free to make or not, but what he is obliged to, and as a reward of debt to man's work. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. If election springs from and depends upon the works of men, let no man ascribe it to the grace of God, for there is nothing of grace in it, if this be the case. Otherwise, work is no more work. That will lose its nature, and ought to lose its name too, and not to be called a debt, but a free gift. But these things are contrary one to another, so unalienable and unalterable in their natures, that the one cannot pass for the other, or the one be joined with the other, in this or any other part of man's salvation. For what is here said to be of election holds true of justification, pardon of sin, and the whole of salvation. The Ethiopic version applies it to justification.